It was just another calm morning on the Atlantic, gulls wheeling overhead, the water glinting silver in the early light, until old Thomas's fishing line went tight. Not the heavy pull of a tuna or the flutter of mackerel, but something strange. When he hauled it in, the catch wasn't a fish at all, it was a bottle, green glass, worn smooth by decades of waves. Inside, a single sheet of paper, yellowed and brittle. The handwriting was uneven, the ink faded to a ghost of itself. It read, "If you find this, know that I once dreamed of seeing the world, but I never did." No name, no date, no clue who had sent it drifting into the deep. Thomas had spent his life fishing these waters, the same horizon every day. But now, the sea had given him a mystery, and at 72 years old, Thomas decided he would not let this dream die in a bottle. Thomas lived in a small coastal town in Maine, the kind of place where everybody knew everybody, and everyone knew him as the old fisherman who never left. For more than 50 years, his life had been as predictable as the tides, mornings out at sea, afternoons repairing his weathered nets, and evenings spent by the crackling fire in his one-room cabin. The ocean was his world, and until that day, he had thought it was enough. But the note in the bottle, it stayed with him. He read it again and again, tracing each faded word with his calloused fingers. "I once dreamed of seeing the world, but I never did." Who had written it? A sailor, lost to the waves? A young dreamer whose life had turned another way? Were they still alive, or just a memory now drifting out there with the tides? It gnawed at him in the quiet moments over his morning coffee, when the harbor was still asleep. In the hush of evening, when the gulls had gone silent, he imagined the life behind those words, a life cut short of its promise, and he thought about his own. Thomas didn't have much money, he didn't own a computer, he didn't know the first thing about tracking down a stranger from nothing but a scrap of paper, but he had something else, a stubborn heart, and the sea in his blood. So he made a decision. If he couldn't find the person who wrote those words, he would become their legs, their eyes, their witness. He would see the world for them, and in doing so, he'd make sure that dream would not be lost to the bottle forever. The paper smelled faintly of salt, and something else, not just the brine of the ocean, it was softer, sweeter, perfume, the kind that lingered on a scarf, or in a letter, kept close to the heart. Old Thomas didn't know what to make of it, so he carried the bottle and its fragile cargo to the town librarian Sarah, a sharp-eyed woman who had grown up among these same docks and houses. She laid the note on the desk as if it were a rare treasure, her fingers brushing over the shaky handwriting. "This looks like it's from the 1970s, she murmured, tilting the page to catch the light. "Maybe from someone on the old whaling cruise, or a traveler who never made it back." Thomas leaned in, listening like every word might open a door. They began digging first through the library's dusty archives, then through ship manifests that smelled of mildew and ink, and stacks of yellowed newspapers whose headlines had long been forgotten. Names, dates, departures, arrivals, but never the one they needed. Hours passed. The tide outside had gone out and begun to return again before Sarah finally paused, holding the page up close. "Wait," she said. Her finger traced the jagged edge of the note. "This corner, it's torn from a bound journal, not just any kind either. I've seen this paper stock before." She disappeared into the back room, the sound of boxes shifting and shelves creaking. When she returned, she was holding a faded notebook. "This brand," she said, "was only sold in a handful of shops in New England. Most of them closed decades ago." Thomas's heart quickened. "But," she went on, a small smile tugging at her lips, "one of them, it's still open, Boston." It had been more than 40 years since Thomas had left Maine, and even then, the farthest he'd ever gone was the next town over. But now, he stepped off the train in Boston like a man setting foot in a foreign land. The air was sharper here, laced with the smell of exhaust and roasted chestnuts from street vendors. The station hummed with voices, none of them familiar. Clutched in his hand was the brittle note, sealed again in its bottle, as if carrying proof of the sea's secret. He followed directions, scribbled on a scrap of paper. until he found the shop, its wooden sign weathered, the gold lettering faded, but still proud. Harrison and Sons, Stationers, Est, 1891. Inside, the air smelled of paper and ink, a scent untouched by time. Behind the counter stood the owner, a weary man with silver hair and spectacles perched halfway down his nose. Thomas explained about the note, the torn edge, the search. The man's eyes lit up with recognition. "Oh yes, those journals," he said, disappearing into the back and returning with the dusty ledger. "We sold them mostly to college kids and to sailors heading abroad, dreamers, really. They'd stand right here, talking about the places they'd see." He ran a finger slowly down the pages until he stopped. "Here, Margaret Ellis." Thomas leaned in. The name meant nothing, and yet it seemed to fill the room. "She bought 2 journals," the owner continued. "Since she was going to sail around the world, but after that big storm in '78, her name never showed up in the harbor records again." Thomas felt his pulse quicken. Had this bottle been adrift for decades, carried by currents he'd spent his life on? And if it had, could Margaret still be out there somewhere, waiting for her story to be finished? The trail ended at a quiet nursing home on the outskirts of Providence, a white clapboard building facing the sea. The air smelled faintly of salt and blooming hydrangeas. Somewhere inside, a piano was playing softly. In a sunlit corner by the window sat an elderly woman, her hands trembling slightly as they rested on her lap. She gazed out toward the water, as if watching for a ship that would never come. Thomas stepped forward, the bottle cradled in his hands. When he introduced himself and gently slid the fragile note onto her lap, her breath caught, her eyes filled with tears that shimmered in the afternoon light. "I threw that into the water," she whispered, her voice unsteady. "The day I realized I'd never leave. I thought it would be lost forever." Her name was Margaret Ellis. She told him how life had anchored her in ways she never planned. Years spent caring for an ailing mother, then a younger sister, then her own children. Travel had always been next year, till next year never came. She had never gone farther than the rocky coves just beyond the harbor, but her mind had wandered endlessly. Thomas sat beside her, listening as she painted the world with her words. The pastel villages along Italy's coast, the towering blue ice of Alaska's glaciers, the warm Caribbean waters she imagined sparkling under the sun. For hours, the two of them spoke, one reliving a life that might have been, the other quietly deciding it wasn't too late for that dream to touch the horizon. Before leaving, Thomas made her a promise. "You may not have sailed the world," he told her softly, "but I will take your dream with me." Margaret's eyes glistened, and she reached for his hand, her fingers cool but steady. "Then you'll be my sails," she whispered. Outside, the evening tide was rolling in, the sky painted in bands of gold and violet. Thomas slipped a small photograph of Margaret into his pocket, its edges worn but the smile unmistakable. It would be his compass now, guiding him beyond the horizon. He'd always known. For the first time in his 72 years, he began to plan a journey not measured by the weight of a catch, but by the miles between dreams. He traced a route on an old map, not to the fishing grounds, but to the very port she had once circled in her journal. Decades before, the sea had carried her words to him. Months later, Thomas set sail, his small boat creaking under the weight of maps, supplies, and a story bottled by time. The horizon stretched wide and endless, but he carried a clear course, the dream of a woman he'd only just met. At every port, he found a quiet corner, bought a postcard, and wrote to Margaret describing the colors of foreign markets, the smell of distant seas, the way the sun sank behind unfamiliar shores. Her dreams were unfolding now, letter by letter, through his eyes, because adventure doesn't belong only to the young or the wealthy. It belongs to those willing to take the first step, or in Thomas's case, the first tide. And sometimes, the sea delivers more than fish. Sometimes, it delivers second chances.